Abandoned, alone, left to die in the unforgiving desert. But this loyal dog never stopped waiting. Days passed, the scorching sun burned its body, and the cold nights drained its strength. Yet it remained, believing its owner would return. Until one day, a stranger collapsed nearby, just as lost, just as broken. A battered pickup truck rumbled down the dusty road, its rusted frame rattling with every bump. The vehicle, a faded blue Chevrolet from the early 2000s, looked like it had seen better days. Its paint chipped, its windshield covered in a fine layer of desert dust. The driver inside was a man in his mid-50s, his face hardened like sun-scorched leather. His name was Earl Watson, a man whose life had been defined by bad decisions and even worse luck. Earl had once been a small-time rancher, but a combination of poor investments, gambling debts, and a drinking problem had stripped him of everything. His face, lined with years of hard living, held no remorse as he gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles pale beneath the dirt. The only thing that stirred beneath his cold exterior was the frustration gnawing at his gut. He had no choice. At least that's what he told himself. The truck skidded to a stop at the edge of the vast, unforgiving desert. The sun loomed high above, a merciless inferno in the cloudless sky. Earl reached across the seat and unlatched the door. A German shepherd tumbled out, hitting the burning sand with a dull thud. The dog let out a sharp yelp, but quickly scrambled to its feet, shaking its coat of dust. It was a strong, well-built animal, its fur a blend of black and tan, though now dulled with grime. Despite the heat, its coat was thick, the remnants of a well-fed life still visible beneath the dirt. The dog's ears twitched as it turned toward the truck. Its deep brown eyes locked onto Earl with an expression that could only be described as confused betrayal. It had known this man its entire life, had trusted him, protected him, followed him. It didn't understand, but Earl didn't meet its gaze. His grip tightened on the steering wheel as he avoided looking in the rearview mirror. He had convinced himself that the dog would be fine, that it would find water somewhere, maybe even make it back to civilization. But deep down, he knew the truth. No one survived the desert alone. The dog took a hesitant step forward, its paws sinking into the scorching sand. But before it could reach the truck, the engine roared back to life. A cloud of dust kicked up behind the spinning tires. And then, he was gone. The German shepherd stood frozen, its tail lowered, ears perked, as it watched the truck disappear into the shimmering horizon. It didn't chase after him. It simply stood there, its head tilting slightly as if expecting him to return. Minutes passed, then an hour. The heat pressed down like an iron weight, and the wind whispered through the barren expanse, carrying only silence. The dog, once called Max, sat down and waited. The desert stretched infinitely in every direction, a vast wasteland of sand and rock, broken only by the occasional twisted shrub. The ground was cracked and dry, the kind of terrain where only the toughest creatures could survive. Max was not built for this. He had been raised on a farm, where he had known the cool shade of a barn and the refreshing splash of water troughs. His days had been spent running through golden fields, his nights curled up by a warm hearth. But that life was over now. As the hours dragged on, his breathing became heavier. His thick coat, meant to protect him in colder climates, now trapped the heat against his body. His pink tongue lolled from his mouth as he panted, desperate for relief. Yet he stayed. Because dogs did not abandon their masters. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long, jagged shadows across the landscape, Max's body wavered. His legs trembled, exhaustion pulling at his muscles. Then, in the distance, something moved. It was subtle at first, just a faint blur against the mirage-drenched air, but as the shape grew closer, Max's ears perked. A man. He stumbled forward, his steps uneven, his body swaying as if each movement took everything he had left. His clothes, once respectable, were now torn and stained with sweat and dust. He was tall, lean, but not in the way of an athlete. He was thin, almost gaunt, as if life had been slowly eating away at him. This was Daniel Carter, a man who had lost everything. His dark hair clung to his forehead in damp strands, and his hazel eyes were sunken, the kind of eyes that had seen too much and endured more than they should have. His hands were shaking as he pressed them to his sides, his breath shallow. Daniel had once been a police officer, a man who had dedicated his life to justice, to truth. But justice had not been kind to him. 3 years ago, he had uncovered corruption within his own department, a smuggling ring dealing in rare and exotic animals. But instead of being rewarded, he had been framed. His badge was taken, his career destroyed, and his reputation shattered. No one had believed him. He had tried to fight back, but the law was not on his side. With nowhere to go, he had drifted. A fugitive, not in the legal sense, but in every other way. And now he was dying. He had underestimated the desert, thinking he could cross it on foot. His water had run out a day ago, his last meal even further behind. He had pushed forward on sheer willpower alone, but now his body was giving up. He took another step, then another, his vision blurred, the world tilted, and then he collapsed. Max didn't move at first. The man lay sprawled on the sand, his face turned to the side, his breathing shallow. His hands were caked in dirt, his lips cracked from dehydration. Max took a cautious step forward, nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air. The man smelled of sweat, dust, and something else. Something familiar. He smelled like someone who had been abandoned. Max had no reason to trust him. Humans had never given him a reason to. But as the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of blood from a cut on the man's temple, something stirred within the dog. Loyalty was not something that could be turned off. And so, for the first time since being left behind, Max moved. He padded closer, circling Daniel's unmoving form. He sniffed at his face, then nudged his arm with his nose. The man didn't stir. Max sat beside him, his breathing heavy, his body exhausted. But he didn't leave, because he understood what it meant to be alone. As the desert night settled in, bringing with it the bitter cold, Max curled up beside Daniel, pressing his body against him. Not for warmth, but for something deeper. For companionship, for survival, for hope. The sun bore down relentlessly, a fiery sphere of torment high in the sky, turning the desert into an inferno. The sand shimmered in waves of heat, distorting the horizon and making the air ripple, as if the entire world were melting. The German shepherd Max had stopped panting hours ago. His throat was parched, his body aching from the unbearable dryness. His thick coat trapped the heat, weighing down on him like a heavy blanket. Every step felt like dragging himself through thick mud. But still, he did not leave the spot where his owner had abandoned him. Loyalty ran deep in Max's veins, deeper than survival instincts, deeper than logic. It was ingrained in him from the moment he had opened his eyes as a pup. Yet now, that very loyalty was killing him. As the sun crawled westward, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange, Max's vision blurred. He swayed slightly, exhaustion pulling him toward the ground, but he resisted. He needed water. He needed shade. He needed something. Anything. Then, as if the desert itself had exhaled a breath of life, a figure appeared in the distance. At first, it was just a vague outline, distorted by the waves of heat. But as it grew closer, it took the shape of a man, moving unsteadily, his legs dragging through the sand. He wasn't walking. He was stumbling, his body betraying him with each step. Max's ears twitched, his body going rigid as he watched. His instincts told him to be wary, but his exhaustion overpowered any sense of fear. He simply stood there, watching as the man collapsed a few feet away, his body hitting the ground with a dull thud. The man lay motionless, his chest barely rising and falling with each shallow breath. His clothes, once a white button-down and dark jeans, were now caked with dust and sweat. His skin, once fair, had turned an angry shade of red from sun exposure. His lips were cracked, his dark hair matted to his forehead. Max sniffed the air. The man smelled of dirt, sweat, and desperation, but there was no scent of hostility. Minutes passed, then an hour. The desert remained silent, save for the whisper of the wind shifting grains of sand. The man did not move. Max remained where he was, his body tense, his breathing shallow. He had every reason to walk away, but he didn't. Because something in him, something primal, something beyond mere instinct, recognized the look of abandonment. He knew what it meant to be left behind. Darkness descended upon the desert like a blanket, bringing with it a biting cold that contrasted sharply with the day's merciless heat. Max, despite his exhaustion, remained alert. He had survived the night before, alone and vulnerable. Now, With the presence of this stranger, his senses sharpened once more. The man still had not moved. Max could hear his weak, uneven breaths, the faint rustling of fabric as his body occasionally twitched against the cold. Max crept closer, his paws soundless against the sand. His nose brushed against the man's outstretched hand, feeling the roughness of his calloused fingers. The scent of sweat and something metallic, blood maybe, lingered faintly. Then, suddenly, the man stirred. A soft groan escaped his lips, a barely audible sound that sent Max retreating a step. The man's fingers twitched, then curled slightly as if grasping for something that wasn't there. Slowly, with great effort, he cracked his eyes open. Hazel eyes, dulled from dehydration, met deep brown ones. For a long moment, they simply stared at one another. Then, with slow, shaky movements, the man attempted to push himself up. His arms trembled beneath his weight, his entire body weak and drained. Max took a cautious step forward, watching as the man finally sat up, swaying slightly. He blinked a few times, trying to focus. His voice, when he finally spoke, was hoarse and barely above a whisper. "A dog?" Max said nothing, only tilting his head slightly. The man let out a weak chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "You're real, right?" His lips curled in a half-smile, though it was filled more with exhaustion than amusement. Max didn't move, nor did he look away. With great difficulty, the man reached for the bag slung over his shoulder. His fingers fumbled as he unzipped it, his hands shaking from weakness. From inside, he pulled out a plastic water bottle, half full, the liquid inside sloshing slightly. Max's ears perked, his body tensed, but he did not move forward. The man stared at the bottle for a moment, debating, before he opened it and took a careful sip. He winced as the water hit his raw throat, but the relief was immediate. Then, something unexpected happened. Instead of drinking more, the man extended the bottle toward Max. Max hesitated. He had learned that not all humans were kind. Not all humans were good. He had been taught that even those you trusted could leave you behind without a second thought. But thirst was an undeniable force. Slowly, cautiously, Max inched forward. The man tilted the bottle slightly, pouring a small stream of water into his cupped palm. Max sniffed, then, after a pause, lapped up the precious liquid. For the first time since being abandoned, relief flooded his parched throat. The man watched him with tired eyes. "I take it you're lost too," he murmured. Max had no answer, but the way he sat, close but not too close, said enough. The man took another sip of water, then exhaled shakily. He studied the dog before him. The strong build, the thick coat, the sharp intelligence in its eyes. He could tell this wasn't just any dog. "You're not some stray, are you?" Max blinked but gave no other response. The man let out another quiet chuckle, shaking his head slightly. "Figures. I end up in the middle of nowhere, half dead, and the only company I get is a dog." He let his head rest against his knees, his breath slow and uneven. Silence stretched between them once more, interrupted only by the soft rustling of the wind. Eventually the man shifted. He pulled his bag closer, feeling the weight of its limited contents. A nearly empty water bottle, 2 protein bars, a pocket knife, and a folded map that now seemed useless. He sighed. "Well," he murmured, more to himself than to Max, "I guess we'll see if we survive the night." Max didn't leave, because deep down, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the thirst, beneath the hunger, he knew. He knew that this man was just as lost as he was. And perhaps, just perhaps, they were meant to find each other. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. The air was still, the silence stretching infinitely, broken only by the soft, rhythmic breaths of the man and the dog beside him. The desert, though a place of desolation, had its own way of waking. The cool of the night lingered for just a few precious moments before the inevitable heat would reclaim the land. Daniel Carter stirred, his body stiff and aching from sleeping on the unforgiving sand. His eyelids fluttered, and for a brief moment, he was caught between the remnants of a dream and the stark reality he had woken into. A warm breath ghosted across his cheek, pulling him fully into consciousness. He opened his eyes. The German shepherd, still and watchful, was lying beside him, its deep brown eyes locked onto his. Max, though visibly exhausted, hadn't left his side. Daniel blinked, momentarily disoriented. He had expected to be alone. He had expected that, just like everyone else in his life, This dog would have abandoned him too. But it hadn't. A strange sensation settled in his chest, something dangerously close to hope. With slow, deliberate movements, he shifted, feeling the strain of dehydration pull at his muscles. His fingers fumbled with the zipper of his backpack, pulling it onto his lap. It felt lighter than he remembered. Unzipping it, he reached inside, his hands brushing against what little supplies he had left. A half-empty plastic water bottle, 2 protein bars, one partially crumbled, a pocket knife tucked into the side pouch. That was it. It wasn't enough. Daniel sighed and unscrewed the cap of the water bottle, bringing it to his cracked lips. He took a cautious sip, the lukewarm liquid soothing the rawness of his throat. It wasn't much, but it was something. He lowered the bottle and turned his head slightly, glancing at the dog. Max was watching him intently, his ears perked, but his posture relaxed. He didn't beg, didn't whimper, he simply waited. Daniel exhaled slowly. For the first time in days, he wasn't entirely alone. A pause. Then, with quiet resolve, he tilted the bottle and let a small stream of water pool into his palm before extending it forward. Max hesitated, his ears flicking back in uncertainty. Daniel kept his hand steady. He could see the tension in the dog's body, the wariness, the lingering distrust, and yet, thirst was stronger than fear. After a long moment, Max leaned in, his tongue flicking out to lap at the offering. Daniel felt the roughness of his tongue against his skin, the warmth of his breath, the subtle tremor in his movements. He let Max drink until the water was gone, then pulled his hand back and wiped the dampness onto his jeans. For a second, neither of them moved. Then something shifted. It was unspoken, but it was there, a fragile understanding, a silent acknowledgement. Daniel reached into the bag again, pulling out one of the protein bars. He unwrapped it carefully, then broke off a piece, placing it down between them. Max eyed it, sniffed cautiously, then took the offering. As the first rays of sun stretched across the desert, 2 lost souls shared what little they had. Hours passed. The heat returned with a vengeance, the golden sand now scorching to the touch. Daniel knew they couldn't stay here. They had to move. His body protested as he pushed himself upright, his limbs sluggish, his head still foggy from dehydration. Max, sensing the shift in energy, stood as well, shaking off the dust that clung to his fur. Daniel glanced around, trying to determine which direction held the best chance of survival. West led deeper into the desert. South was where he had come from. Too far, too hopeless. That left north. He had no guarantee that there was anything ahead, but he had to believe that there was something. A road, a gas station, a miracle. With one last swig of water, he secured his bag over his shoulder. "Come on, boy," he murmured. "Let's go." Max didn't hesitate. He followed. The sun hung high in the sky, unrelenting. Their progress was slow. Both man and dog weakened from exhaustion and lack of sustenance. Every step sent waves of heat radiating through their bodies. Daniel's vision swam at the edges, but he forced himself forward. Stopping wasn't an option. Max stayed close, his ears twitching at every distant sound, his nose occasionally lifting to the air as if searching for something unseen. Then, a sound, faint, distant. Daniel stopped. Max did too. At first, it was barely noticeable, blending into the hum of the wind. But then it grew louder, more distinct. The low, rhythmic rumble of an engine. Daniel's heart kicked against his ribs, his head snapped up, eyes scanning the horizon. There, just barely visible through the waves of heat, was a dust trail, a vehicle, salvation, or danger. He clenched his fists, debating. If it was a good person, they might help. If it wasn't, he was in no condition to fight back. But he had no choice. He stumbled forward, his legs weak but determined. Raising a trembling hand, he waved as the vehicle approached. The truck was an old Ford, its red paint dulled by years under the sun. It was covered in dust, the tires kicking up small clouds as it rolled closer. Daniel could see the driver now, a man in his late 40s, burly, with sun-creased skin and sharp blue eyes. His name was Tom Henderson, and he had spent most of his life running a small auto repair shop in Arizona. His hands, thick with calluses, gripped the steering wheel with practiced ease. Tom was a man of few words, known for his no-nonsense attitude and deep-rooted belief that people should look out for one another, but not everyone deserved help. Life had made him skeptical, cautious. As the truck slowed, Tom narrowed his eyes at the sight before him. A ragged man, barely standing, and a dog that looked just as worn. Rolling down the window, he called out, his voice gruff. "What the hell are you doing out here?" Daniel's throat was too dry for words. Tom studied him for a moment, then let out a sharp sigh. "Jesus, get in." Relief hit Daniel like a tidal wave. He staggered to the passenger door, pulling it open. Max hesitated at his feet. Tom eyed the dog. "Yours?" Daniel glanced at Max. "Was he?" "Yeah," he rasped. "He is." Tom grunted. "Fine. Get him in too." Daniel opened the door wider. "Come on, Max." For a moment, Max just looked at him. Then, with a small huff, he jumped onto the worn leather seat. The door shut. And just like that, they weren't alone anymore. As the truck rumbled forward, Daniel let his head fall back against the seat, his body finally relaxing. He didn't know where they were going, but for the first time in a long time, he had a chance. The truck rumbled down the deserted highway, its worn tires kicking up dust in the fading light of the evening. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with exhaustion and silence. Daniel Carter, slumped in the passenger seat, could feel his body still vibrating from the rough desert journey, but at least he was no longer walking. His throat, though parched, no longer burned with the relentless thirst of the previous days. He had survived. Beside him, Tom Henderson, the gruff, broad-shouldered man who had picked them up, kept his hands firm on the steering wheel. His blue eyes flicked toward Daniel occasionally, studying him the way a mechanic might study a busted engine, trying to figure out if it was worth fixing. Max, the German shepherd, was curled up in the back seat, his body still tense despite the relative comfort of the vehicle. His ears twitched every so often at the sound of passing wind or the occasional crackling of the old radio, but he didn't sleep. Like Daniel, he had learned that safety was never guaranteed. The road stretched ahead, endless and lonely, cutting through the vastness of the desert like a scar on the land. The sky above was beginning to shift, the sun bleeding out into the horizon, casting a fiery glow that would soon give way to the cold indigo of night. Tom was the first to break the silence. "Where the hell were you headed?" Daniel exhaled, his voice still rough. "Nowhere, just away." Tom scoffed. "Away's a dangerous place, friend, especially when you don't have a plan." Daniel didn't argue. He had stopped having a plan long ago. A beat passed before Tom spoke again. "You look like hell, and that dog of yours ain't doing much better." Daniel turned slightly to glance at Max, whose eyes were half-lidded but still alert. "Yeah," he muttered, "we've been through it." Tom grunted. He wasn't the kind of man who pried. If someone wanted to talk, they would. And if they didn't, well, that was their burden to carry. They drove in silence for another hour before Tom finally pulled into an old, beat-up gas station off the highway. The neon sign flickered, "Wayne's Fuel and Rest," barely holding on to life. "I need to refuel," Tom said, cutting the engine. "If you're coming with me, I'd suggest stretching your legs." Daniel nodded, but his movements were sluggish as he climbed out of the truck. His muscles groaned in protest, and for a brief second, he had to steady himself against the door. Max jumped down beside him, landing gracefully, but even the dog looked weary. His ribs were slightly visible beneath his thick fur, a sign that he hadn't eaten properly in days. Daniel reached into his pocket, pulling out the remaining protein bar from his pack. He unwrapped it, broke it in half, and tossed a piece to Max. The dog caught it mid-air and chewed slowly, his eyes never leaving Daniel's. Tom returned from the station store carrying 2 bottles of water and a pack of beef jerky. He tossed one of the waters at Daniel. "Drink. You look like you're about to keel over." Daniel caught it and twisted the cap off, downing half of it in one go. It was warm, but it didn't matter. Tom leaned against the truck, chewing on a strip of jerky, before finally speaking again. "So, who the hell are you?" Daniel wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Nobody." Tom snorted. "That's so." Daniel hesitated. Then with a slow breath he said, "I used to be a cop." Tom's chewing slowed slightly. "That right?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah, until I wasn't." Tom didn't press, but he didn't need to. Something about the way Daniel had said it, flat, detached, told him everything he needed to know. Daniel slid down against the truck, resting his back against the door. The night air was settling in, cooler now, wrapping around them like a quiet presence. Then he spoke again. Not because Tom had asked, but because for the first time in a long time, he felt like saying it out loud. I worked for LAPD. 7 years. Good record. Clean record. He let out a bitter laugh. Thought I was doing something that mattered. Tom said nothing, but his gaze remained fixed on Daniel, waiting. There was a case, a smuggling operation. Exotic animals, underground rings, the kind of stuff no one wants to admit still happens in this country. I found a trail, started putting pieces together. Thought I was making progress. Daniel's hands tightened into fists. Turns out, I was stepping on the wrong toes. Tom exhaled through his nose. Let me guess. Internal corruption? Daniel nodded. Yeah. Some guys higher up, real clean-cut, respectable types. The kind that don't get their hands dirty but make sure other people do. His jaw clenched. I was naive. Thought if I got enough evidence, went through the right channels, the system would work. He shook his head. It didn't. Tom folded his arms. They burned you. They burned me. Daniel let out a slow breath, tilting his head back against the truck. Framed me. Made it look like I was the one leaking info to the smugglers. Stripped me of my badge, my pension. Took everything. And just like that, I wasn't a cop anymore. I was just another guy who got in the way. Tom let that sit for a moment. Then he said, That's a hell of a story. Daniel laughed dryly. Yeah, well, it's not just mine. Tom frowned slightly, confused. Daniel looked down at Max, who was still beside him, staring off into the desert. He's got one too. Tom raised an eyebrow. Daniel glanced at Max, then back at Tom. He was a guard dog for one of those smugglers. Trained, disciplined, did his job. His voice dropped slightly. And when things got bad, when the cops finally showed up, his guy just drove off. Max didn't react to the words, but something about his posture shifted just slightly. Daniel exhaled. So yeah, I lost everything. He reached over, scratching Max gently behind the ear. So did he. Tom studied them both, his expression unreadable. Then he let out a long breath, shaking his head. Well, ain't that some poetic bullshit? Daniel smirked. Yeah. Tom pushed off the truck. Get in. We got miles to cover before morning. Daniel nodded and stood, his legs still aching but steadier now. As he climbed back into the truck, Max followed without hesitation. For the first time in a long time, neither of them was completely alone. The past was still there, hanging heavy on their shoulders. But for now, they had the road ahead. And that was enough. The truck pulled into the gravel parking lot of a worn-out gas station on the edge of nowhere. The neon sign flickered weakly. Wayne's Fuel and Rest, barely clinging to life, much like the place itself. The gas pumps were outdated, their chipped paint revealing rust beneath. The small convenience store attached to the station looked just as tired, its windows streaked with dust, its wooden door warped from years of weathering the harsh desert sun. Tom killed the engine and exhaled, running a hand through his graying hair. Need to refuel, he muttered, and you two look like you could use a break. Daniel, still feeling the weight of dehydration and exhaustion, simply nodded. He glanced at Max, curled up in the back seat, his ears twitching slightly but his body too tired to remain tense. The dog had fought to survive just as much as he had, but even Max had limits. Tom grabbed his wallet and climbed out of the truck. Stay put, I'll handle the gas. Daniel, however, didn't stay put. He needed water, something fresh. Stepping out onto the gravel, he stretched, feeling every muscle protest before adjusting his backpack strap and heading toward the convenience store. As soon as he stepped inside, the cool, stale air hit him. The place was dimly lit, the buzzing fluorescent lights above barely cutting through the gloom. The aisles were narrow, packed with shelves holding canned goods, bags of chips, and old newspapers yellowing at the edges. The smell of old coffee and cheap tobacco lingered in the air. Behind the counter stood Linda, the store's owner. She was in her mid-50s, lean and wiry, with a face carved by time and hardship. Her short, graying hair was pulled back in a low ponytail, revealing sharp cheekbones and piercing brown eyes that had seen too much to trust easily. She wore a faded plaid shirt and old jeans, the fabric worn from years of labor. She had the look of someone who had spent her life surviving, not living. Linda barely glanced up from the small radio she was fiddling with. its dial barely catching the frequency of some distant country song. "Need something?" she asked, her voice dry, uninterested. Daniel walked toward the coolers at the back of the store. He grabbed 2 bottles of water and a small bag of jerky before heading toward the counter. As he placed the items down, Linda finally looked at him, a slow, assessing gaze that lasted just a second too long. "Not from around here," she noted. Daniel tensed slightly. "Just passing through." Linda's eyes flickered toward the window, where Tom was still outside, leaning against the truck as the gas pumped. Her gaze then shifted toward the dog in the back seat before settling back on Daniel. She reached under the counter and tossed a small strip of dried meat onto the counter. "For the dog." Daniel hesitated. "Take it," Linda said, her voice softer now, though her sharp eyes still held caution. "Looks like he's been through enough." Daniel picked up the strip of jerky, stuffing it into his pocket with a quiet "thanks." Linda didn't smile, didn't nod, just went back to adjusting the radio. Daniel quickly paid, feeling Linda's gaze linger on him as he turned to leave. Outside, the sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. As Daniel walked back toward the truck, he spotted 3 highway patrol officers pulling into the station. His stomach clenched. They were driving a marked patrol SUV, dust coating its sides from long hours on the road. The officers inside looked relaxed, talking amongst themselves as they stepped out of the vehicle. But one of them caught Daniel's eye. Keller. He was young, probably late 20s, with short, neatly cut blonde hair and a lean but athletic frame. His uniform was crisp despite the dust, and there was something in his expression. Sharp, calculating eyes that missed nothing. He didn't have the tired, indifferent look of the older officers. He was still hungry, still eager to prove himself. And that made him dangerous. Daniel lowered his gaze, keeping his movements casual as he approached the truck. Max perked up slightly, ears twitching as he sensed the change in tension. Tom was already watching the officers from where he stood by the pump. Without looking at Daniel, he muttered, "Get in, now." Daniel obeyed, sliding into the passenger seat as Tom finished fueling the truck in record time. Keller, meanwhile, was scanning the area lazily, until his gaze landed on the truck. His expression shifted. Not quite recognition, but suspicion. Tom didn't wait. He slammed the gas cap shut, hopped into the driver's seat, and started the engine. Keller watched them, his brow furrowing slightly. He said something to the other officers, but they didn't react immediately. As Tom pulled out onto the road, Daniel forced himself not to look back. Only once they were a safe distance away did he let out a slow breath. Tom gripped the wheel tighter. "That kid back there? He saw something." Daniel nodded, staring out at the darkening horizon. "I know." Silence filled the cab for several long minutes. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, the last traces of daylight melting into deep blues and purples. The cool of night was creeping in, but Daniel still felt the lingering heat on his skin. Tom exhaled through his nose. "You can't outrun this forever, you know?" Daniel didn't respond. Tom shook his head. "Sooner or later, you gotta figure out what the hell you're gonna do." Daniel remained quiet, his mind racing. He had been running for too long. And now, with Keller's suspicion growing, he knew it was only a matter of time before the past caught up to him. Max, sitting in the back seat, let out a low, quiet huff, as if he, too, knew that the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. Daniel reached down and scratched the dog's ear absent-mindedly. "I know, boy," he muttered. For the first time in a long time, Daniel felt something stirring inside him. Not fear, not exhaustion, something else. Something that felt a lot like resolve. The truck rumbled along the quiet highway, its headlights cutting through the thickening dusk. The desert stretched endlessly on both sides, barren and indifferent to the struggles of the 2 men and the dog inside. The tension in the cab was thick, neither man speaking, lost in their own thoughts. Tom had one hand on the wheel, the other resting against the cracked leather armrest. His fingers tapped absently, a habit he had when he was thinking. His sharp blue eyes flicked toward Daniel before turning back to the road. "So," Tom finally said, his voice calm but firm, "what's the plan?" Daniel stared out the window, his mind blank. "I don't have one," he admitted. Tom let out a long sigh. "Yeah, figured as much." Silence settled again. The road stretched ahead, endless and dark. After a few more miles, Tom pulled the truck over to the side of the road. The engine idled softly as he shifted in his seat to face Daniel. "Listen," he said, his voice low but firm. "I've met a lot of men in my time. Good ones, bad ones. And then there's guys like you, lost ones." Daniel didn't react. Tom continued. "I get it. You got screwed. But if you keep running, you're going to end up dead, and no one's going to remember your name except as a footnote in some case file." Daniel glanced down at Max, who was curled up in the back seat, his ears twitching slightly as if he were listening to every word. Max had been abandoned too, but he hadn't just sat there and waited to die. Daniel inhaled slowly. "I want my name cleared," he finally admitted. "I want the truth to come out." Tom studied him for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "All right, that's a start." He turned back to the road, shifting the truck into drive. "I know someone who might be able to help. No guarantees, but if you want to fight back, this is your best shot." Daniel frowned. "Who?" Tom's grip on the wheel tightened slightly. "Raymond Carter." Daniel's brows knitted together. "The Raymond Carter?" Tom smirked. "The one and only." They drove through the night, heading toward a small town nestled in the outskirts of El Paso. The streets were quiet, the buildings mostly single-story, old but well-maintained, the kind of place where people knew each other's names, and strangers weren't welcome for long. Tom pulled the truck into a narrow alley beside a dimly lit diner. The neon sign above flickered "Rosie's Cafe," its light barely illuminating the cracked sidewalk in front. "This where he is?" Daniel asked, scanning the empty parking lot. Tom nodded. "Yeah, he comes here late at night, always sits in the same booth, drinking the same shitty coffee." Daniel exhaled, feeling the weight of the moment. Raymond Carter wasn't just anyone. He was a former FBI investigator, one of the best. He had once been known for uncovering some of the biggest corruption cases in law enforcement, but after a messy fallout with the Bureau, he had disappeared from the public eye. Some said he had been forced out, others said he had simply lost faith in the system. Either way, if there was anyone who could help Daniel, it was him. But convincing him would be another battle entirely. Tom killed the engine and turned to Daniel. "Look, Carter doesn't do favors. If you want his help, you're going to have to give him something." Daniel nodded and opened the door. Max followed immediately, jumping down from the truck with practiced ease. Together, they walked toward the diner. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and fried food. The place was nearly empty, save for a lone man sitting in the farthest booth, a cup of black coffee steaming in front of him. Raymond Carter. He was in his early 60s, tall and broad-shouldered, with silver-streaked hair and a face lined with the weight of too many battles. His eyes were a piercing gray, cold and calculating, like a man who had spent his life seeing through lies. He didn't look up as they approached, but his posture shifted slightly, a sign that he had already taken note of them. Tom slid into the seat across from him without hesitation. Daniel hesitated for half a second before doing the same. Max sat beside the table, ears perked, but stayed silent. Raymond finally looked up. His gaze settled on Daniel for a long, unreadable moment before he spoke. "I know who you are." Daniel tensed slightly but didn't look away. Raymond took a slow sip of coffee, then placed the cup down. "And I know why you're here." Tom smirked. "Well, that saves us some time." Raymond ignored him, his attention locked on Daniel. "You're the cop from Los Angeles, the one who got burned." Daniel swallowed. "That's right." Raymond leaned back in his seat. "You want me to help you?" Daniel nodded. "I do." A long silence stretched between them. Then Raymond exhaled and shook his head. "No." Daniel's stomach sank. "What?" Raymond's voice was calm but firm. "I don't get involved in dead cases. And yours? It's been buried so deep no one's going to dig it up again." Daniel clenched his fists. "I have evidence. I know the people responsible." Raymond's gaze sharpened. "You had evidence. If you still had it, you wouldn't be here." Daniel didn't speak. Raymond smirked, but there was no humor in it. "You think you're the first guy who comes looking for justice after the system chewed him up? I spent decades trying to fix a system that doesn't want to be fixed. I lost everything because of it." His eyes darkened. "I'm not about to do it again." Daniel's jaw tightened. "So that's it? You just gave up?" Raymond's expression didn't change. "I learned my lesson." Silence settled between them. Tom looked between them, waiting for someone to break first. Daniel exhaled sharply. "If you don't help me, they win." Raymond was quiet for a long moment. His fingers tapped against the ceramic rim of his cup. Finally, he spoke. "I'm not saying yes," he said, "but I'll listen." Daniel leaned forward. That was all he needed. Outside, Keller sat in his patrol car at the edge of town. He had been following their trail ever since the gas station. He hadn't made a move yet, but his instincts told him something big was happening. He pulled out his radio, hesitating for a brief moment before pressing the button. "This is Officer Keller," he said. "I think I've found him." The air in El Paso carried the faint scent of rain on dust, a strange mix of freshness and dryness that seemed fitting for a town caught between old ghosts and new beginnings. The streets were quiet this late at night, dimly lit by neon signs flickering in and out of life. Outside Rosie's Cafe, the small diner where Raymond Carter had just agreed to listen, Daniel took a slow breath. This was the moment. No more running. Inside, Raymond sat across from Daniel in the worn-out booth, his fingers loosely curled around a cup of coffee, now gone cold. The former FBI agent had a rigid posture, his broad shoulders squared even in casual clothes. His gray-streaked hair was neatly combed, though deep lines on his face suggested a man who had spent too many years in battles that had left more scars than victories. His sharp, steely gray eyes studied Daniel with the precision of a man who had seen too many liars to take anything at face value. Tom sat beside Daniel, arms crossed, silent but alert. Max lay on the floor at Daniel's feet, his ears twitching every so often as he listened to the muffled sounds of the street outside. Raymond exhaled, tapping his fingers against the tabletop. "You want me to help you dig up a case that the system already buried?" Daniel nodded. "I have to clear my name." Raymond let out a dry chuckle. "And what exactly do you have? Evidence? Witnesses? Because if all you've got is a sob story, I can tell you now, nobody's going to care." Daniel clenched his jaw. He had evidence once, files, recordings, financial trails leading to high-ranking officials. But after they framed him, they had wiped everything clean. The only proof left was inside his head. "I had everything," Daniel admitted. "They made sure I lost it." Raymond gave a knowing smirk. "That's the problem with the truth, son. It's fragile, and if the wrong people hold the power, it never sees the light of day." He leaned forward slightly. "So tell me, what exactly do you want from me?" Daniel swallowed hard. "I need to expose them." Raymond raised an eyebrow, but there was something behind his stare, not disbelief, but curiosity. "They framed me," Daniel continued, voice steady despite the weight of the words. "They ruined my life, took everything from me, and they're still out there doing the same thing to others. I may not have the evidence anymore, but I know who they are. I know how they operate." Raymond's gaze narrowed. "And you think that's enough?" Daniel glanced down at Max, then back at Raymond. "I think if I don't fight back, then I'm no better than them." For a long moment, Raymond didn't respond. Then he sighed and rubbed his temple. "Damn it," he muttered. "I was really hoping I wouldn't care." Tom chuckled. "Yeah, well, you're still you, Carter. No way you were walking away from this one." Raymond shot Tom a glare before turning back to Daniel. "All right, listen carefully. If you really want to take these guys down, it's not going to happen overnight. We need leverage. We need names. And most importantly, we need proof." Daniel nodded. "I know." Raymond leaned forward, voice lower now. "I still have contacts. Not many, and not the kind you want to owe favors to, but enough to get us started. If you can asterisk find a way to get back into the system, into their files, their transactions, we might have a chance." Daniel exhaled, feeling something he hadn't in a long time. Hope. But before he could respond, Max's ears suddenly perked up. A low growl rumbled from the dog's throat. Daniel tensed. Max only reacted like that when something was wrong. Raymond noticed too. His eyes flicked toward the large window of the diner, and that's when he saw him. Keller. The young patrol officer was across the street, leaning against his cruiser, watching them. His blonde hair was slightly tousled from the wind, his arms crossed over his uniformed chest. He wasn't making a move yet, but the way his sharp, analytical eyes were fixed on them said everything. He knew, or at the very least, he suspected. Tom muttered a curse under his breath. "We've been made." Raymond didn't flinch. He simply picked up his coffee cup, took a slow sip, and then placed it down with a quiet clink. "All right," he said. "Looks like we're doing this faster than I thought." Daniel's pulse quickened. What do we do? Raymond locked eyes with him. We don't run. Daniel hesitated. His instinct screamed otherwise. Raymond sighed. Listen, if that kid out there is smart, which he looks like he is, he's going to be patient. He's waiting for backup. If we bolt now, we look guilty. If we sit here like we've got nothing to hide, he might think twice about what he thinks he knows. Tom frowned. And if he doesn't? Raymond shrugged. Then we find out how fast he is. Daniel took a slow breath, forcing his body to stay still. No more running. Keller was still across the street, his eyes never leaving them. But he hadn't made a move. Yet. The seconds stretched into minutes. The tension was suffocating. Then, Keller moved. He pushed off the cruiser and started walking toward them. Max growled low, but Daniel placed a hand on his back, steadying him. Easy, boy. The diner bell jingled as Keller stepped inside. He was younger than Daniel had expected up close, maybe 28, tall but lean, with a rigid posture that spoke of discipline. His uniform was neat, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights, but his eyes, those sharp, piercing blue eyes, were all business. Keller stopped a few feet from their booth. Daniel Carter? Daniel didn't flinch. Officer? Keller studied him for a moment, then shifted his gaze to Raymond. Raymond Carter, ex-FBI. Raymond smirked, leaning back against the booth. You do your homework. Keller's jaw tightened. I know who you are, and I know you're up to something. Silence. Then, Keller took a deep breath, lowering his voice. I don't know if you're guilty, he admitted, but I know something's off about your case. His gaze locked onto Daniel. So I need to know. Are you the man they say you are? Daniel swallowed hard. Then, for the first time in years, he answered with certainty. No. Keller studied him, his face unreadable. Then, after a long pause, he exhaled. Then prove it. Raymond smirked. Oh, we intend to. Keller didn't smile. He simply nodded once, then turned to leave. As the door swung shut behind him, Daniel let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Raymond stretched. Well, that was interesting. Tom exhaled sharply. Yeah, and now we've got a cop watching our every move. Raymond grinned, which means we're finally playing offense. Daniel looked down at Max, who, despite everything, had stayed by his side through it all. For the first time in years, he wasn't running anymore. He was fighting. And this time, he was going to win. The desert sun hung low over El Paso, casting long golden shadows as the final pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. Daniel Carter sat in the dimly lit back room of an old office building, his fingers hovering over the keyboard of a laptop. Beside him, Raymond Carter leaned forward, scanning the digital files that flickered across the screen. Tom Henderson stood near the window, arms crossed, watching the street outside. Max, ever watchful, lay at Daniel's feet, ears perked, sensing the tension in the air. For the past week, they had worked relentlessly, retracing old steps, reaching out to Raymond's former contacts, digging through buried files that weren't supposed to exist. And now, at long last, they had proof. Daniel exhaled, his heartbeat steady but heavy with anticipation. Names, transactions, emails, everything the corrupt officials had tried to erase had been hidden in a secured server they never thought anyone would access again. But Raymond still had his tricks. This is it, Raymond muttered, his voice carrying both triumph and exhaustion. This is enough to burn them all down. Daniel clenched his jaw. It had taken years, but justice was finally within reach. Earlier that morning, Officer Keller had arrived with news that changed everything. You were right, Keller admitted, his sharp blue eyes filled with reluctant respect. I pulled some strings, accessed some records. They buried your case fast. Too fast. Keller had been skeptical, but as he peeled back the layers of corruption, he realized Daniel's case wasn't just another internal scandal. It was a cover-up at the highest level. You're not the only one they've done this to, Keller had continued. And if we move now, we can expose them before they bury this deeper. That had set everything in motion. Now, as the data loaded onto an encrypted drive, Daniel felt something shift inside him. For the first time in years, he wasn't looking over his shoulder. He was looking forward. With everything they needed, they put their plan into action. Keller, using his position in the department, forwarded the evidence to trusted journalists and federal investigators, people Raymond had vetted, ones who couldn't be bought. By noon, the first headlines were already hitting the news. High-ranking officials tied to illegal smuggling ring. Whistleblower case resurfaces after years in the dark. Ex-police officer framed. New evidence suggests corruption cover-up in LAPD. The fire spread quickly. The people who had ruined Daniel's life were now the ones being hunted. Warrants were issued, arrests were made. And Daniel? He was no longer a fugitive. A week later, Daniel stood in front of a courthouse, breathing in the crisp morning air. The media had swarmed him for days, but for the first time, the cameras weren't painting him as a criminal. They were painting him as a survivor. Tom clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Hell of a way to clear your name." Daniel smirked. "Took me long enough." Raymond, standing nearby, let out a low chuckle. "Well, you made it, and you didn't even get yourself killed. I'm impressed." Daniel shook his head. "Couldn't have done it without you." Raymond shrugged. "I owed the system a punch in the gut anyway." Keller approached, looking less like a skeptic and more like an ally. "Your record's being wiped clean," he said, handing Daniel a folder. "They're offering reinstatement." Daniel hesitated, his fingers grazing the folder's edge. "I'm not sure I want to go back," he admitted. Keller gave a small nod. "Then don't. You've already done more good exposing this than you ever could in a uniform." Daniel exhaled, glancing down at Max, who wagged his tail slightly, as if sensing the relief in the air. For years, Daniel had only known one thing: running. But now, he was free. He crouched down, rubbing Max's head. "What do you think, boy? New life?" Max licked his hand in response. Daniel grinned. "Yeah, I think so too." As the sun rose higher in the sky, Daniel walked away. Not as a fugitive, not as a broken man, but as someone who had finally won his fight. And this time, he wasn't looking back. In the dead of night, a baby's wail shattered the silence of the house. Sophie jolted awake, heart pounding, and rushed to her son's room. Then, she froze. Under the dim glow of the nightlight, Milo, the cat, sat perched on the crib's edge, his fur bristling, eyes glowing eerily. Oliver lay there, his tiny hand twitching weakly. Red scratches streaked across his fragile arm. Sophie's chest tightened. No, it couldn't be. Had he hurt her baby? Sophie pressed her palm against the cold wooden floor, groggy from a night of broken sleep. The sun had barely started to seep through the curtains of her suburban home, casting thin golden streaks across the nursery walls. She pulled herself up, glancing at the baby monitor on her nightstand. Oliver's soft breathing echoed through the small speaker, a reassuring sound that had become the background of her life since the day he was born. At 28 years old, Sophie had always been petite, standing barely over 5'4", with long chestnut brown hair that curled naturally at the ends. Motherhood had carved new features into her: dark circles under her once bright green eyes, a permanent crease between her brows from worry, and an almost instinctive twitch every time Oliver so much as stirred in his crib. She had always been gentle, patient, the kind of woman who whispered lullabies to stray kittens. But ever since Jack had started traveling more for work, leaving her alone with Oliver, that patience had started to thin, replaced by an ever-present exhaustion. She shuffled to Oliver's crib and leaned down, her fingers grazing his tiny arm as she prepared to change his diaper. That was when she saw them. Thin, red scratches trailed along his soft baby skin. Her breath caught in her throat. She blinked, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. How did this happen? Oliver squirmed, but didn't cry, oblivious to his mother's rising panic. Sophie's gaze darted across the room. The nursery was quiet, still. Nothing seemed out of place. His blankets were neatly folded at the edge of the crib, his stuffed animals arranged in a perfect row on the shelf. And then her eyes landed on Milo. The cat sat by the window, his golden amber eyes fixated on her. He was a 5-year-old Russian blue, sleek, elegant, his silver-gray coat pristine as ever. He had been with Sophie and Jack since he was a kitten, long before Oliver was even a thought. Milo had always been a calm, affectionate cat, never one to scratch or bite unless provoked. He would curl up in Sophie's lap while she read, press his small head against her palm when she was feeling down. But now, as she looked at Oliver's scratched arm, an ugly suspicion crept into her mind. Had Milo done this? Her heart pounded in her chest as she slowly turned to him. The cat didn't move, only blinked once, his tail flicking lazily. Sophie swallowed hard. She wanted to believe that Milo was innocent, but how else could Oliver have gotten those scratches? He was too young to have done it to himself, and there was no other explanation. She scooped Oliver into her arms, holding him protectively against her chest, and took a slow step toward Milo. The cat's ears twitched, but he remained still. "Did you do this?" Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. Milo gave no response, of course. But as if sensing her growing distrust, he stretched and leapt from the window ledge, landing softly on the nursery floor before slinking out of the room. Sophie let out a shaky breath, tightening her hold on Oliver. Maybe it had been an accident. Maybe Milo had jumped into the crib during the night, and Oliver had startled him. But the thought unsettled her. If it had happened once, it could happen again. That night, after feeding Oliver and rocking him to sleep, she carefully laid him down in his crib. For a moment, she just stood there, watching his tiny chest rise and fall with each breath. Then, movement from the corner of her eye made her stiffen. Milo. He had crept silently into the nursery and now sat near the crib, staring at Oliver. His eyes glowed in the dim light, reflecting the warmth of the night lamp. Sophie's pulse quickened. Milo moved, gracefully but deliberately, leaping up onto the crib's edge. Sophie reacted instantly. "No!" she snapped, her voice louder than she intended. She lunged forward, shooing Milo away. The cat jumped down with a startled hiss, his tail puffing slightly as he darted toward the doorway. Her hands trembled as she closed the nursery door, ensuring Milo wouldn't be able to get back in. She lingered for a moment, guilt gnawing at her. Milo had never given her a reason to doubt him before, but she couldn't take any risks, not with Oliver. As she lay in bed that night, listening to the quiet hum of the baby monitor, Sophie couldn't shake the image of those tiny scratches on Oliver's arm, or the way Milo had sat so still, watching. Something about it unsettled her, and she wasn't sure why. Sophie sat on the couch, staring at the baby monitor as Oliver slept soundly in his crib. The house was eerily quiet except for the occasional rustling of tree branches against the window. She tightened her grip on the phone, listening to the familiar hum of static before Jack's voice finally came through. "Look, Sophie, I know you're worried, but are you sure about this? Milo's never been aggressive before." Jack's voice was calm, steady, too steady, as if he was trying not to sound dismissive. Sophie sighed, pressing her fingers against her temple. "I don't know what else to think, Jack. I keep finding scratches on Oliver, and Milo is always there, watching him." Jack exhaled heavily on the other end. "But watching doesn't mean attacking. Maybe you're just exhausted. You haven't had a full night's sleep in weeks. You said it yourself. Oliver is still so small, he moves a lot in his sleep. What if he's scratching himself?" Sophie shook her head. "No, Jack. These scratches aren't random. They look like claw marks. And last night, I caught Milo in the crib again. He was just sitting there, staring at Oliver. It was eerie." Jack paused before responding. "Did you actually see him scratch Oliver?" Sophie swallowed. "No, but then maybe we don't have the full picture," Jack said, his voice softer now. "I just don't want you to do something you'll regret. You love that cat." "I love our son more," Sophie snapped, and the silence that followed made her chest tighten. When Jack spoke again, his voice was careful. "I know, Sophie, I know. Just talk to someone first. Maybe your mom. Get another opinion before making any decisions." Sophie didn't reply right away. She glanced at the hallway where Milo lay curled up near the stairs, his sleek gray fur barely visible in the dim light. His tail twitched, his amber eyes half-lidded but aware. He was watching her. Finally she muttered, "Fine, I'll talk to my mom." But even as she said it, she knew her mind was already made up. The next morning, Sophie bundled Oliver into his stroller and walked the few blocks to her mother's house. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of damp leaves and fresh-cut grass, but Sophie barely noticed. Her thoughts were tangled, looping through the same doubts and fears. Helen Peterson was a woman who radiated quiet strength. At 58, she had silver-streaked auburn hair, always neatly pulled into a bun, and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. She had been a single mother for most of Sophie's childhood, raising her with a no-nonsense approach that had shaped Sophie's own sense of independence. Helen opened the door before Sophie could knock, as if she had been expecting her. "You look exhausted," she remarked, stepping aside to let Sophie in. Sophie barely had time to sit down before Helen placed a steaming cup of tea in front of her. She always knew what Sophie needed before she even said a word. Helen sat across the kitchen table, her expression expectant. "Tell me what's wrong." Sophie hesitated, tracing the rim of her mug before finally speaking. "It's Milo. I think he's been scratching Oliver." Helen raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure?" Sophie exhaled. "No, but I keep finding marks on Oliver's arm, and Milo is always near him. Last night, I caught him sitting in the crib, just staring." Helen took a slow sip of tea before setting her cup down. "And what makes you think he's hurting Oliver?" "I don't know how else to explain it," Sophie admitted. "Jack thinks I'm overreacting. But what if I'm not?" Helen studied her for a moment before leaning back in her chair. "Sophie, you've had that cat for years. Milo's never been aggressive. If anything, he's always been protective of you." Sophie's stomach twisted. She knew that. Milo had always been affectionate. He was the kind of cat that curled up beside her when she was sick. The kind that followed her from room to room, never demanding attention, but always present. But now, she couldn't ignore the unsettling feeling in her gut. "I just can't take the risk," Sophie murmured. "I think I need to rehome him." Helen's expression didn't change, but Sophie saw the flicker of disapproval in her eyes. "That's a big decision," she said simply. "I know," Helen sighed. "You're a mother. Your instinct is to protect Oliver. But just be sure, Sophie, if you give Milo away and find out later he wasn't the problem, you'll regret it." Sophie swallowed hard, but her mind was already made up. That evening, she called Lisa, a close friend from college. Lisa had always been the type to take in strays. Dogs, cats, even a pet rabbit once. She was tall, lean, with wild, curly blonde hair that always seemed to be one gust of wind away from complete chaos. She worked as a veterinary technician and had a small house filled with rescued animals. When Sophie explained the situation, Lisa didn't hesitate. "I can take him for a while," she said over the phone. "If you change your mind, you can take him back." Sophie nodded, even though Lisa couldn't see her. "Thanks, Lisa. I think this is for the best." That night, as she packed up Milo's things, the cat watched her, his tail flicking. He didn't try to run, didn't meow for attention. But when she set his carrier near the door, he stood up and walked toward Oliver's crib, his movements slow, deliberate. Sophie froze. Milo leapt onto the dresser beside the crib, staring down at Oliver, his ears twitching. Then he let out a soft meow, barely a sound. Sophie's chest tightened. "Not tonight, Milo," she whispered, picking him up gently, but Milo didn't struggle. He didn't resist. He just let out one long, low sound, a sound Sophie had never heard before. Something deep and sad, almost like a warning. She carried him downstairs, placed him in the carrier, and zipped it closed. As she turned away, Milo let out another cry, sharper this time, more urgent. Sophie ignored it. She told herself she was making the right choice, even as guilt clawed at her from the inside. Sophie woke up to the sound of Oliver stirring in his crib. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting soft golden streaks across the nursery. She rubbed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of exhaustion settle over her shoulders. Last night had been the first night without Milo in the house. She had expected to sleep better, free from the gnawing anxiety of watching the cat hover near Oliver's crib. But instead, she had tossed and turned, an unshakable feeling of unease wrapping around her like a second skin. Pushing aside the blankets, she made her way to Oliver's crib, her heart lifting at the sight of him stretching his tiny arms. But as she reached down to pick him up, her breath caught in her throat. There, on his forearm, were fresh scratches. Sophie's stomach dropped. Her mind scrambled for an explanation. Milo wasn't here. So how was this happening? She traced the small red marks with her fingers, careful not to wake Oliver. They were thin, slightly raised, like the ones she had seen before. Panic flared inside her. Had she been wrong all along? Had Milo been innocent? A deep guilt settled into her chest, but she pushed it aside. Right now, she needed answers. Sophie spent the morning thoroughly checking the nursery. She ran her hands along the crib's wooden bars, looking for any rough edges that might have scratched Oliver. Nothing. She stripped the sheets, inspecting them for anything sharp. Still nothing. By the time she finished, her frustration had built into a tight knot in her chest. Determined to eliminate every possibility, she carefully clipped Oliver's tiny fingernails, even though they were already short. Maybe, just maybe, he had scratched himself in his sleep. But the feeling that something was off refused to leave her. By the afternoon, the unease had only grown. As Sophie moved through the house, she found herself listening for sounds that weren't there. Milo's soft footsteps on the hardwood floor, his familiar purring near her feet. Without him, the house felt strangely empty. She called Lisa to check in. "Hey, how's Milo doing?" Sophie asked, pacing the kitchen. Lisa chuckled softly. "Honestly, he's been a bit off. He's not eating much, and he spends most of his time sitting near the front door, like he's waiting for something." Sophie swallowed. "Waiting for what?" "I don't know," Lisa admitted, "but he meows at night, a lot. It's like he knows something's wrong." Sophie pressed her fingers against her temple. "He's never done that before." "Maybe he just misses you," Lisa suggested. "You had him for years. He probably doesn't understand why he's not home." Guilt twisted in Sophie's stomach, but before she could respond, Oliver let out a sharp cry from the nursery. "I have to go," she said quickly, hanging up. She rushed into Oliver's room and found him squirming in his crib, his tiny fists clenched, his face scrunched in distress. The moment she picked him up, his cries softened into hiccups. But what unsettled her more was the way he clung to her shirt, his tiny fingers gripping the fabric tightly, as if he was afraid to be put back down. That night, Sophie kept Oliver in her arms longer than usual, gently rocking him to sleep before hesitantly placing him back in the crib. The moment his body touched the mattress, he let out a sharp wail, his little arms flailing. She frowned, lifting him again. He immediately quieted. She tried a second time, the same reaction. A cold sensation crept up her spine. Why was he suddenly terrified of his crib? She glanced around the dimly lit nursery. Everything was the same as it had always been. His stuffed animals neatly arranged on the shelf, the baby monitor glowing faintly on the dresser. There was no logical reason for Oliver to be this upset. But as she shifted her gaze back to the crib, unease clawed at her gut. What if she had misjudged everything? Had she focused so much on Milo that she had ignored the real problem? Her fingers tightened around Oliver as he buried his face against her shoulder, whimpering softly. She sat down in the rocking chair, holding him close, her heart pounding harder than it should. For the first time since Milo had left, she wasn't sure she had made the right choice. Sophie sat at the dining table, her fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The baby monitor rested on the table, its soft glow illuminating the quiet room. She hadn't slept much the night before. Every time she closed her eyes, Oliver's cries echoed in her mind, the way he clung to her as if terrified of being put down. It wasn't normal. Something was wrong. Her gaze flickered toward the empty space where Milo's food and water bowls used to be. The house felt eerily silent without him, and no matter how much she told herself it was for the best, guilt gnawed at her. But this wasn't about Milo anymore. She needed answers. By midday, she had made up her mind. She drove to an electronics store and purchased a small, discreet baby monitor with a built-in night vision camera. If something was happening in Oliver's room at night, she would see it. She wouldn't just assume. The employee who helped her was a man in his 40s, tall and lean, with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. His name tag read Carl. He had the air of someone who had spent too many years working retail. But when Sophie explained that she was a new mother wanting to monitor her baby's sleep, his expression softened slightly. "Good choice," Carl said, handing her the box. "This model's got motion detection, records in HD, and has infrared for nighttime. If anything moves in that room, you'll see it." That was exactly what she needed. That night, after Oliver had finally settled, Sophie placed the camera on a high shelf across from the crib, adjusting the angle so it covered the entire room. She synced it to her phone and tested it a few times, watching as the live feed displayed a grainy but clear view of Oliver sleeping soundly. She left the nursery door slightly ajar, listening to the faint hum of the baby monitor as she curled up in bed. The weight of exhaustion pulled at her, but anxiety kept her alert. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, she woke suddenly, heart pounding. The house was too quiet. Sophie grabbed her phone, blinking against the harsh glow of the screen as she pulled up the live feed. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Oliver lay still in his crib, the faint rise and fall of his chest barely visible in the dim infrared light. Then, movement. Her breath caught. At first, it was subtle. The door of the built-in wardrobe in Oliver's room, a door she was sure she had closed, shifted slightly. It was slow, almost imperceptible. But as she stared, frozen, it creaked open just a fraction more. A small, dark shape emerged from the gap. Sophie's blood turned to ice. A rat. A large one. Its beady black eyes gleamed in the infrared light as it crawled down from the wardrobe, its thin, hairless tail dragging behind it. Horror tightened in her throat as she watched it skitter across the floor, straight toward Oliver's crib. Sophie shot out of bed, her body moving before her mind could catch up. She bolted down the hallway, slamming the nursery door open so hard that it banged against the wall. Oliver let out a startled cry. Her eyes darted to the crib, just in time to see the rat scurrying away, disappearing into the shadows beneath the dresser. Sophie didn't hesitate. She grabbed Oliver into her arms, clutching him so tightly he whimpered in protest. Her breath came in sharp gasps, her heart racing. She had been so wrong. Milo hadn't been the danger. He had been the protector. The next morning, Sophie sat at the kitchen table, watching the footage again, frame by frame. The scratches on Oliver's arms, the way he cried when put in the crib, the fear. It all made sense now. But as she kept watching, another realization struck her. A memory. A detail she had ignored before. Milo. The last time she had seen him near the crib, he hadn't been hurting Oliver. He had been watching something. Protecting him. Sophie pressed a shaking hand to her mouth. She had misjudged everything. And now, Milo was gone. Sophie's fingers trembled as she held the phone to her ear, her heart pounding against her ribs. The moment Lisa picked up, Sophie barely let her speak before blurting out, "Lisa, I made a mistake. I need Milo back. Please tell me he's okay." There was silence on the other end before Lisa sighed. "Sophie, I was going to call you this morning." Sophie's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" Lisa hesitated. "Milo's gone. He got out last night. I don't know how. One minute he was lying by the front door, and the next, he was gone. I looked for him, but he just vanished." Sophie's world tilted. "Oh, God." She pressed a hand to her forehead, nausea creeping in. "I'm so sorry," Lisa continued. "I thought maybe he'd come back this morning, but there's no sign of him." Sophie barely heard her. Her pulse roared in her ears. This was her fault. She had abandoned him, misjudged him, and now he was gone. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "I have to find him." Sophie ran out of the house without thinking, her breath fogging in the cool morning air. She didn't even stop to put on a coat. She just ran. Lisa lived only a few blocks away, and as Sophie reached her neighborhood, she scanned the streets desperately. "Milo!" she called, her voice breaking. The streets were eerily quiet. A few early risers were out walking their dogs or jogging, but no one paid her any mind. She stopped at a small corner store, where an older man in his 60s was standing outside, leaning on a wooden cane. His name was Mr. Reynolds, a retired school teacher who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. He was thin, with wisps of white hair and deep wrinkles that lined his face like an old map. His expression was always kind, though today he looked puzzled as he watched Sophie panting in the cold. "Looking for something?" he asked, his voice gravelly but gentle. Sophie swallowed the lump in her throat. "My cat. A gray Russian blue. He ran away last night." Mr. Reynolds scratched his chin. "Can't say I've seen him, but if I do, I'll let you know." Sophie nodded, barely hearing his words. Milo was out there somewhere, alone, and she had to find him. By the time she returned home, Jack's car was in the driveway. The sight of it should have brought relief, but as Sophie stepped inside, all she could feel was the weight of failure pressing down on her. Jack was in the living room, setting down his travel bag. His brown eyes locked onto her the second she stepped through the door. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a quiet strength about him, the kind of man who didn't speak much, but always carried a steady presence. "Sophie," he said, immediately noticing the panic in her eyes. "What happened?" She didn't speak, just walked straight to him and collapsed into his arms. For a few moments, Jack just held her, his hands rubbing slow, calming circles on her back. Then he murmured, "Tell me what's wrong." Sophie pulled away, looking up at him with red-rimmed eyes. I was wrong, Jack. About Milo. He wasn't the one hurting Oliver. It was a rat. A huge one. I saw it on the camera last night. It was climbing into the crib, scratching him. Milo was trying to stop it. Jack's brows furrowed, but he didn't interrupt. He just listened. Tears slipped down Sophie's cheeks. And now, he's gone. I gave him to Lisa and he ran away last night. I've been looking everywhere, but I can't find him. Jack's expression softened. We'll find him. Sophie shook her head. I don't know if we will. Jack cupped her face gently, forcing her to meet his gaze. Listen to me, Soph. We'll find Milo. Together. His quiet certainty steadied her more than anything else had all morning. Just as Jack reached for his jacket, Oliver's cry pierced through the baby monitor. Sophie froze. Something was wrong. She raced upstairs, Jack on her heels. When she reached the crib, she felt her heart stop. Oliver was burning up. His little face was flushed red, his body hot to the touch as he whimpered weakly. "Oh my God!" Sophie whispered, panic gripping her. "He has a fever!" Jack immediately pressed a hand to Oliver's forehead, his jaw tightening. "We need to take him to the doctor, now." Sophie's mind raced. The rat. It had been in the crib. What if it had carried a disease? What if Oliver had been exposed to something dangerous? Guilt slammed into her with full force. This was her fault. If she had listened to Milo from the start, Oliver wouldn't have been in danger. Jack didn't waste time. He grabbed the car keys, and within minutes, they were on the way to the pediatrician's office. The waiting room was unbearably sterile. White walls, pale blue chairs, the faint scent of antiseptic lingering in the air. The receptionist had told them the doctor would see them soon, but every second felt like an eternity. Sophie held Oliver tightly, rocking him back and forth, murmuring soft reassurances even as tears burned in her eyes. A few minutes later, Dr. Patel, their pediatrician, walked in. She was in her late 40s, petite but commanding, with sharp dark eyes, and a confident presence that made people trust her immediately. She had always been warm and patient with Sophie, but today her expression was all business. She examined Oliver carefully, checking his temperature, his skin, his breathing. Finally, she straightened. "He has a mild fever, but it doesn't seem severe," Dr. Patel said. "However, you mentioned a rat." Sophie nodded quickly. "Yes, it was in his crib last night. It scratched him." Dr. Patel's expression darkened. "That's concerning. Rats can carry bacteria. We'll run some tests to be safe. If anything comes up, we'll treat it immediately." Sophie's throat was tight. "Is he going to be okay?" Dr. Patel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We caught it early. That's the most important thing." Sophie nodded, but the weight of guilt didn't lift. By the time they got home, Oliver was already looking better. His fever had gone down slightly, and he had started drinking his bottle again. But Sophie couldn't rest. She needed to do something. That night, she called a professional pest control service. The man who answered, Mark, sounded professional but gruff, probably someone who had seen one too many infestations. "If there's a rat in the house, we'll take care of it," he assured her. "We'll do a full inspection, seal off any entry points, and set traps. You won't have to worry about this again." Sophie exhaled. "Thank you." It was a step, but it wasn't enough. She needed to find Milo. She owed him that much. Sophie stood in front of the community notice board at the corner of their street, carefully pinning up yet another flyer. Her hands were stiff from the cold, the late autumn air biting at her fingertips. The paper crinkled slightly under her grip, the words, "Lost Cat Milo," printed in bold at the top, followed by a photo of his sleek gray fur and piercing amber eyes. Beneath it, she had scrawled, "Please call if found. He is dearly missed." It had been 4 days since Milo had disappeared, and every moment without him felt heavier than the last. Jack stood beside her, silent but steady, holding the stack of remaining flyers in one hand. His other hand rested on her lower back, a grounding presence amid her turmoil. "We'll find him," he said quietly. And though she appreciated his confidence, Sophie wasn't sure she believed it anymore. They had searched everywhere, every street, every alley, every park. They had spoken to neighbors, left messages at vet clinics, even checked with the local animal shelters. But there was no sign of Milo. The worst part was the gnawing guilt. Milo hadn't run away because he wanted to. He had left because she had sent him away. Sophie clenched her jaw against the emotion threatening to spill over. She couldn't afford to break down. Not yet. That evening, they sat at the kitchen table, exhaustion written in every line of their faces. Jack flipped through his phone, checking the neighborhood watch group for any sightings. Sophie stared at her untouched dinner, her appetite long gone. Oliver had finally started to recover. His fever had gone down, and he was back to his usual babbling self. That should have been a relief. But instead, it just reminded Sophie of how badly she had failed Milo. "I think we should check near the supermarket again," she murmured, more to herself than to Jack. Jack nodded. "I'll go with you tomorrow. Maybe he's hanging around where there's food." Sophie barely slept that night, her mind playing cruel images of Milo alone, cold, hungry. "Where are you, Milo?" The next morning, as Sophie sat curled up on the couch, her phone rang. She nearly dropped it in her haste to answer. "Hello?" A woman's voice, gentle but firm, came through the line. "Hi, is this the number for the lost cat?" Sophie sat up straight, her heart hammering. "Yes. Have you seen him?" "I think so. There's been a gray cat hanging around the parking lot behind the supermarket on Maple Street. He looks thin, but he won't let anyone near him." Sophie didn't even wait to ask further questions. "I'm on my way." She grabbed her coat, barely registering Jack's voice calling after her as she sprinted out the door. The supermarket parking lot was quiet when Sophie arrived, the early morning light casting long shadows across the asphalt. The few cars parked near the entrance were still covered in a thin layer of frost. She scanned the area, her pulse thudding in her ears. And then she saw him. Near a row of dumpsters, partially hidden behind an overturned shopping cart, a familiar gray shape crouched low to the ground. Sophie's breath hitched. Milo. He looked thinner, his normally smooth coat dirty and unkempt. His ears were pressed back, his tail flicking nervously as he watched a pigeon pecking at scraps nearby. For a long moment, she just stood there, overwhelmed. Then, slowly she crouched down and whispered, "Milo?" The cat froze, his head turned slightly, ears twitching. Sophie swallowed past the lump in her throat. "It's me, baby. I'm so sorry. Please come home." Milo hesitated. He stared at her for what felt like an eternity, his golden eyes searching hers. Then, as if deciding whether he could trust her again, he took a single step forward. Sophie held her breath. Another step, then another, and then, just as he reached her, he collapsed into her arms. A sob broke free from Sophie's throat as she clutched him tightly, feeling his thin body tremble against her. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she buried her face in his fur. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I was wrong. You were protecting Oliver, and I didn't see it. Please forgive me." Milo let out a low, tired purr, pressing his face against her coat. And for the first time in days, Sophie felt whole again. Sophie sat on the living room floor, a warm towel in her hands as she carefully wiped down Milo's matted fur. The cat sat still, too exhausted to protest, though his tail flicked slightly every now and then. He had lost weight in the days he had been gone, his ribs faintly visible beneath his thick gray coat, but despite his rough appearance, his golden eyes remained sharp, watchful. Jack sat nearby, observing quietly as Sophie worked. His broad shoulders were slightly hunched, his expression softer than usual. Oliver was nestled in his arms, chewing absent-mindedly on his tiny fingers, his fever completely gone. Sophie's hands shook slightly as she rubbed a damp cloth over Milo's paws, trying to remove the dirt that had clung to them. Guilt still gnawed at her, even now. "I don't know how I could have been so wrong," she murmured. Jack reached over, brushing his fingers against hers. "You were trying to protect Oliver." She shook her head. "Milo was trying to protect him too, and I didn't see it." Milo let out a soft purr, nudging his head against her wrist, as if forgiving her. That night, Sophie set up a small bed for Milo in the corner of the living room, placing his favorite blanket there. But as soon as she stood up, Milo ignored it completely and padded down the hallway, his tail flicking behind him. Sophie followed. He went straight to the nursery. Her heart clenched as she watched him hop up onto the small dresser beside Oliver's crib, curling into a neat ball. His ears twitched, and his gaze remained fixed on the sleeping baby, his posture alert but relaxed. It hit Sophie then. Milo wasn't just back. He was still guarding Oliver. Tears blurred her vision as she stepped forward, running a gentle hand down his back. "You never stopped protecting him, did you?" she whispered. Milo purred, his eyes half closing in contentment. Jack appeared in the doorway, watching the scene unfold. He didn't say anything, but his small, knowing smile said enough. Sophie took a deep breath, wiping her eyes. She bent down and kissed Oliver's forehead, then reached out and stroked Milo's fur. She had spent so much time trying to keep Milo away that she hadn't realized he had belonged by Oliver's side all along. And now, as she stood there, her husband beside her, her son safe, and her cat returned, she knew their family was finally whole again. Sometimes the greatest protectors come in the most unexpected forms. Sophie thought she was shielding Oliver from danger, but in truth, she had turned away the very guardian God had placed in their home. How often do we, in our fear and uncertainty, push away the blessings that God has sent to protect us? This story is a reminder that God's love and protection come in ways we don't always recognize. Just as Milo never stopped watching over Oliver, even after being cast out, God never stops watching over us, even when we turn away. His grace, His guidance, and His love remain constant, even in our moments of doubt. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder that love, in its purest form, is always present, even in the smallest of creatures. Leave a comment below and tell us about a time when you saw love and protection in an unexpected way. And before you go, let's take a moment to pray. Dear Lord, thank you for surrounding us with unseen blessings and protectors, even when we fail to see them. Help us to trust in your plan, to recognize your love in the everyday moments, and to never turn away from the gifts you place in our lives. Please watch over every person reading this, filling their hearts with faith, comfort, and peace. In Jesus' name, amen. May God bless you and your loved ones. Don't forget to share this story and spread His love.